Latoshia Daniels spoke publicly for the first time about her relationship with Brodes Perry and the night of the shooting. And she recapped that night that she allegedly shot and killed Brodes and injured his wife.
Were you angry or were you hurt?
I was hurt. As I was performing oral sex on him, he began to thrust himself inside my mouth really hard. And I told him that that was hurting. Then he grabbed my hair. I had long hair and he wrapped my hair around his hand and he started yanking it. And when he wasn't thrusting himself in my mouth, he was pulling my hair really hard. And with his other hand, he would just hit me and hit me and hit me. And I was like, it's hurting. And he was like, you better not bite me. You better not bite me. And then after that, we had sex and it was just rough and it was hard and it was just not what I was used to. And then once we finished, something he never ever does was he rolled over and just gave me the cold shoulder. And I was like, you're not going to hold me? And he was like, no. And just went to sleep. I felt so used.
A jury has just sentenced 42-year-old Latoshia Daniels to life in prison for the execution-style murder of Memphis pastor Brodes Perry and the attempted murder of his wife. A case that started with a knock at the door ended with gunfire, betrayal, and a courtroom where no one walked away whole. Tonight, we're diving into the story behind a crime fueled by jealousy, obsession, unanswered calls, and the quiet rage of a woman who drove across state lines with a gun and a mission. This is not a case of a stranger. This was someone Pastor Perry once knew, trusted, confided in. Someone his wife had no idea was still orbiting their lives. Before we go deeper, shout out to all loyal Crime Bitz viewers. Thank you for always supporting and engaging with these stories. If you're new here, welcome to the family. Let's get into it. Because the truth is, what unfolded in that Collierville home didn't begin with bullets. It began long before that, with a connection that blurred boundaries, with emotions that hardened into obsession, and with a woman who felt abandoned by the one man she believed understood her. Jealousy. Obsession. A pastor living a double life. A woman who drove across state lines in silence. And a marriage blindsided by a knock at the door. Moments before the shooting, neighbors heard nothing unusual. No arguments, no screaming, just the sound of a normal, quiet evening. But inside that house, within minutes, everything would change. And that leads us to the questions at the heart of this story. What makes an educated, accomplished social worker drive more than 2 hours with a loaded gun to confront a man she once trusted? Why did she insist she only came to talk, yet walked in armed? How does a respected pastor, a man known for preaching about healing, forgiveness, and faith, end up in the center of such a deadly emotional storm? And why did Latoshia scream, "You broke my heart," as she opened fire inside the home? Those questions lingered over the courtroom like smoke. And as prosecutors laid out the events, the emotion behind every decision became clearer. Love gone wrong, trust twisted into fixation, and a loyalty that transformed into obsession. Because when you trace the story backward, before the flashing lights, before officers stormed into the living room, before the pastor fell to the floor, you find a connection that never ended the way one woman wanted it to. What looked like a normal evening for the Perry family was actually the ending of a long emotional fuse that had been quietly burning for years. And that is where this story truly begins. Before the gunshots, before the trial, before the life sentence. It began with two people whose lives intertwined in ways neither fully understood, and with a woman who could not accept being cut off. Before the fatal night, before the confrontation that ended one life and shattered another, there was the quieter story, the emotional undercurrent that had been building for years. And at the center of that story was Latoshia Daniels, a woman whose life on paper looked stable, accomplished, even admirable. Latoshia held a master's degree in social work, a field built on empathy, communication, and helping others navigate emotional storms. To colleagues and acquaintances, she appeared confident, outspoken, and deeply driven. She was the type of woman who walked into a room and immediately took command of her space. But those same strengths came with sharp edges, intensity, attachment, and a deep sensitivity to rejection. What few people realized was that beneath that strong exterior, Latoshia had formed an emotional bond with someone far outside her professional world, Pastor Brodes Perry. Brodes Perry wasn't just any local pastor. He was a respected Memphis church leader, charismatic, articulate, and magnetic in a way that made people feel understood. His sermons were warm, his smile disarming, and his presence powerful. The kind of leader people confided in, trusted, and admired. To his congregation, he was a man of God. To his community, he was a healer. But to Latoshia, he became something much more personal. Somewhere between their conversations, their emotional exchanges, and their private moments of vulnerability, Latoshia developed feelings that went far deeper than friendship. She believed their connection was mutual, special, rare, something set apart from the chaos of everyday life. She saw it as unspoken but undeniable, and for a long time she believed he felt the same. But there was someone else at the center of this story, someone completely unaware of the emotional storm forming outside her home, Pastor Perry's wife. A woman loved within the church, supportive of her husband's ministry, and committed to her family. She wasn't suspicious, she wasn't paranoid, she had no reason to be. She knew her husband had a wide network of people seeking guidance, encouragement, and counseling. It was part of his calling. What she didn't know was that one of those people had crossed emotional boundaries long before she ever knocked on their door. To Latoshia, the pastor's wife wasn't just Perry's partner. She was a barrier. A reminder that the connection she craved, the relationship she believed should have been hers, was never going to exist. And that tension, the silent war between reality and desire, began to shape everything that came next. The truth is, the emotional thread between Latoshia and the pastor was not short-lived. It stretched across years, conversations that felt deep, moments that felt intimate, unspoken promises, or at least interpretations of them. Latoshia convinced herself that what they had wasn't temporary or casual or one-sided. She saw it as unbreakable. But for Perry, the reality was drifting in the opposite direction. As time passed, he began to pull away. Slower replies, shorter conversations, distance that grew wider by the month. Whether it was guilt, fear, or a decision to protect his marriage, he started cutting emotional ties, quietly, subtly, but unmistakably. And to a woman already deeply invested, that emotional shift felt like betrayal. Then came the triggers, calls not returned, messages ignored, and eventually blocked numbers. That final act, being shut out completely, was more than a rejection to Latoshia. It was humiliation. It was abandonment. It was the clearest message she could imagine. He was moving on without her. Something inside her hardened. The bond she saw as spiritual and unshakable suddenly felt severed. And for a woman who believed this connection defined her, losing access to the pastor wasn't just painful. It was intolerable. The snapping point wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It came quietly. The moment she realized she no longer had a place in his life. And that realization is what shifted everything toward the violence that would soon unfold. March 14th, 2019 began without warning, without threats, and without any sign that a storm was quietly closing in on the Perry household. No one in Memphis knew that earlier that afternoon, on a highway 2 states away, a woman was driving toward them with a weight on her chest and a loaded gun in her car. This was not a crime of impulse. It was deliberate, silent, planned in the quiet spaces of a mind that had been unraveling long before anyone realized. Latoshia Daniels left Little Rock, Arkansas with no announcement, no angry messages, no frantic phone calls. There was no digital trail that hinted at her intentions. Just a woman behind the wheel, gripping it tightly, her thoughts looping back to the same man she believed had betrayed her. It was a 2.5-hour drive, long enough for doubt to settle in, long enough for reason to return if it had ever been present at all. But the drive stayed quiet, focused. She took the route straight into Tennessee, passing towns, lights, and exits without hesitation. No one knew she was gone. No one knew she was coming. And in the seat beside her, a loaded handgun. She brought no gift, no overnight bag, no symbolic item of closure. Just a weapon, the one object that showed she hadn't come for reconciliation. There were no texts to Perry to announce her arrival, no calls to demand an explanation. She gave him no chance to prepare, no chance to call police, no chance to escape. She drove with a purpose only she understood, a purpose that grew sharper with every passing mile. It was early evening when she arrived in Collierville, an upscale, quiet suburb where police sirens were rare and unexpected visitors were even rarer. Neighbors later said nothing seemed strange. No alarm, no argument on the porch. Daniels walked straight to the door and knocked as if she belonged there. Calm, steady, composed. When Pastor Brodes Perry opened the door, surprise flickered across his face. He hadn't asked her to come. He wasn't expecting her. But he was polite. That was who he was. His wife, equally startled, tried to process the sudden appearance of a woman she barely knew. Daniels told them she just wanted to talk, to clear the air, to address things that had been left unresolved. Politeness became their mistake. They let her in. Inside the Perry home, the energy shifted quickly. What began as a visit turned into an emotional confrontation neither of them saw coming. Words spilled out of Daniels. Hurt, disappointment, accusations. She told Perry he had ruined her life. She told him he had made promises, emotional promises, that he walked away from. She demanded to know why he cut her off, why he ignored her, why he shut the door. She believed she had earned a right to stay behind. Perry tried to keep his voice calm. His wife tried to understand what was happening. But emotion kept rising like a tide too high to hold back. What started as talking became arguing. What started as pleading became desperation. Tears blurred logic. Voices clashed. And then the shift. The moment the conversation crossed a line neither of them could return from. Daniels reached into her belongings. Her hand closed around the gun. Before either of them registered what was happening, she stepped back, lifted her arm, and pointed the weapon at Pastor Perry. The first shot shattered the room. Perry staggered, shocked, wounded. Then another shot, and another. Executed at close range, with the kind of precision prosecutors later described as cold and intentional. His wife screamed and ran, instinct taking over, as she tried to escape the bullets tearing through the air. She reached for the door, for a hallway, for anything that would save her life. But Daniels followed. One shot hit her, then another. She fell to the floor, bleeding, unable to move but desperately clinging to life. Daniels didn't flee. She didn't drop the gun. She didn't call for help. Instead, something inside her broke open. Witnesses, the surviving wife, first responders, later recalled the moment that defined her state of mind. Daniels screamed, "You broke my heart!" Not shouted in anger alone, but in anguish. A scream ripped from the core of a woman who felt abandoned, exposed, enraged. A scream that prosecutors would later say revealed motive more clearly than any piece of evidence ever could. It wasn't self-defense. It wasn't confusion. It was heartbreak, weaponized. After the final shot, silence filled the room. A silence more chilling than the gunfire. Pastor Perry lay dying on the floor. His wife fought for each breath, blood pooling beneath her. Daniels stood over them, the gun still in her hand, frozen as if the reality of what she'd done had just caught up to her. No words, no movement, just shock, or realization, or a hollowed-out calm that scared first responders when they arrived. And as the last seconds of that night unfolded, the question hung in the air. What happens next? When the first gunshot cracked through the quiet Collierville neighborhood, no one knew what they were hearing. But when the screams followed, sharp, desperate, unmistakably human, neighbors grabbed their phones and dialed 911. Within minutes, patrol units were racing through the subdivision, lights reflecting off well-manicured lawns, the calm of the community shattered. When officers reached the Perry home, the front door was ajar. Inside, the scene was chaos. Blood on the floor, a smell of gunpowder hanging in the air, and two victims, one unresponsive, the other clinging to life. Paramedics rushed in behind the officers. It took only seconds for them to determine that Pastor Brodes Perry was gone. His wife, though gravely injured, still had a pulse. She was immediately stabilized and transported to Regional 1 Health for emergency treatment. But what stunned officers most wasn't just the violence. It was who they found standing inside the home. Latoshia Daniels wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't pleading for help. She was simply there, frozen in place, as if disconnected from everything around her. The handgun was nearby. Her hands were stained. Her expression vacant, gave officers no hint of fear, remorse, or panic. In most homicide investigations, detectives spend days or weeks trying to find their suspect. They chase camera footage, interview witnesses, track cell phones, and retrace steps. But not this time. The suspect was inside the crime scene itself. Daniels was immediately detained, handcuffed, and escorted out of the home while officers secured the area. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She walked as if carried by momentum rather than intention. From there, the investigation moved with unusual clarity. Crime scene technicians began processing the house room by room. The firearm was recovered near the spot where Daniels had been standing. Shell casings were found on the floor, matching the weapon. But the most powerful piece of evidence was the one lying in an ambulance on the way to the hospital, the surviving wife, who had witnessed nearly everything. Even with her severe injuries, her statements at the scene were coherent enough to establish one crucial fact. Daniels had come to the house voluntarily, argued with her husband, then pulled out a gun and opened fire. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle before the shooting, no indication that the victims attacked her in any way. Detectives also seized Daniels' phone. A deeper digital analysis later revealed a steady pattern of emotional distress, calls, messages, and blocked attempts to reach the pastor in the weeks leading up to the confrontation. It painted a picture of fixation, frustration, and spiraling emotion. Nothing in that digital history suggested fear. Everything suggested obsession. Because Daniels never left the home, there was no chase, no manhunt, no uncertainty about who fired the shots. The moment police arrived, the case already had its suspect, a suspect caught literally at the center of the crime. She was transported from the scene to the Collierville Police Department for processing. There was no need for extradition, no interstate coordination, no search warrants for arrest. It was one of the rare homicides where the perpetrator, the weapon, and the motive were all contained in one place. What remained was everything that came afterward: the interviews, the charges, the surviving wife's recovery, and the unfolding legal battle that would eventually pull this case into a courtroom filled with grief, anger, and unanswered questions. The trial of Latoshia Daniels was emotionally charged from start to finish, drawing a courtroom filled with the family of Pastor Brodes Perry, supporters of the church, and reporters following every detail of the case. What had begun as a tragic shooting in Collierville in 2019 now centered on questions of motive, mental state, and intent. When Daniels took the stand, her testimony was emotional, at times erratic. She claimed self-defense, insisting she feared Pastor Perry and that the confrontation escalated unexpectedly. She said she was attacked first, attempting to justify her actions in the moments that led to the shooting. But under careful cross-examination, her story showed inconsistencies, and her behavior oscillated between sorrow, anger, and detachment. The prosecution presented a starkly different narrative. They argued that Daniels did not arrive seeking conversation or closure. She came prepared, with a loaded gun and clear intent. They highlighted her outburst during the shooting. "You broke my heart," a phrase that prosecutors said revealed motive and emotional fixation rather than fear. Then came the testimony of the surviving wife. Her account was harrowing and unflinching. She recalled the moment Daniels pulled the gun on Pastor Perry, the shots fired, and the terror as she tried to escape while being struck herself. Her testimony, combined with the physical evidence, including bullet trajectories, shell casings, and the absence of defensive wounds on Daniels, strongly contradicted any claim of self-defense. After several days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with the verdict: guilty of second-degree murder for the death of Pastor Perry, guilty of reckless endangerment for the attempted harm to his wife. The courtroom reacted with a mixture of grief and relief. Perry's family wept quietly, holding on to one another as the weight of the verdict settled. Daniels' family also showed visible emotion, torn between disbelief and sorrow over the irreversible choices that led to this moment. Sentencing has not yet occurred and is scheduled for December 17, 2025. Until then, Daniels remains in custody, awaiting the official imposition of penalties. This case is a stark example of how unhealed emotions, secrecy, and obsession can escalate into tragedy. A personal bond left unresolved, coupled with fixation and heartbreak, created a deadly combination that permanently altered multiple lives. A moment of rage rooted in emotional turmoil was enough to shatter families and take a life. Thank you for watching this Crime Bitz breakdown. If this story makes you think about the psychology behind obsession and heartbreak, please like, share, and subscribe. And here's a question for you. Do you think obsession develops slowly over time, or can it snap in a single critical moment?